Kinship terminology is the system used in languages to refer to the persons to whom an individual is related through kinship. Different societies classify kinship relations differently and therefore use different systems of kinship terminology. For example, some languages distinguish between affinal and consanguine uncles, whereas others have only one word to refer to both the father and his brothers. Kinship terminologies include the terms of address used in different languages or communities for different relatives and the terms of reference used to identify the relationship of these relatives to each other. Historical view. Anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan performed the first survey of kinship terminologies in use around the world. Though much of his work is now considered dated, he argued that kinship terminologies reflect different sets of distinctions. For example, most kinship terminologies distinguish between sexes and between generations. Moreover, he argued, kinship terminologies distinguish between relatives by blood and marriage. However, Morgan also observed that different languages organize these distinctions differently. He proposed to describe kinship terms and terminologies as either descriptive or classificatory. When a descriptive term is used, it can only represent one type of relationship between two people, while a classificatory term represents one of many different types of relationships. For example, the word brother in English-speaking societies indicates a son of the same parent. Thus, English-speaking societies use the word brother as a descriptive term. A person's male first cousin could be the mother's brother's son, mother's sister's son, father's brother's son, father's sister's son, and so on. English-speaking societies therefore use the word cousin as a classificatory term. Morgan discovered that a descriptive term in one society can become a classificatory term in another society. For example, in some societies one would refer to many different people as mother. Moreover, some societies do not group together relatives which the English-speaking societies classify together. For example, some languages have no one-word equivalent to cousin, because different terms refer one's mother's sister's children and to one's father's sister's children. Armed with these different terms, Morgan identified 6 basic patterns of kinship terminologies. Hawaiian kinship, the most classificatory, only distinguishes between sex and generation. Thus, siblings and cousins are not distinguished. Sudanese kinship, the most descriptive, no two types of relatives share the same term. Siblings are distinguished from cousins, and different terms are used for each type of cousin. Eskimo kinship has both classificatory and descriptive terms, in addition to sex and generation. It also distinguishes between lineal relatives and collateral relatives. Lineal relatives have highly descriptive terms, collateral relatives have highly classificatory terms. Thus, siblings are distinguished from cousins, while all types of cousins are grouped together. The system of English language kinship terms falls into the Eskimo type. Iroquois kinship has both classificatory and descriptive terms, in addition to sex and generation. It also distinguishes between siblings of opposite sexes in the parental generation. A genealogical relationship traced through a pair of siblings of the same sex is classed as a blood relationship, but one traced through a pair of siblings of the opposite sex can be considered an in-law relationship. In other words, siblings are grouped together with parallel cousins, while separate terms are used for cross-cousins. Also, one calls one's mother's sister mother and one's father's brother father. However, one refers to one's mother's brother and one's father's sister by separate terms. Crow kinship like Iroquois, but further distinguishes between one's mother's side and one's father's side. Relatives on the mother's side of the family have more descriptive terms, and relatives on the father's side have more classificatory terms. Thus, Crow kinship is like Iroquois kinship, with the addition that a number of relatives belonging to one's father's matrilineage are grouped together, ignoring generational differences, so that the same term is used for both one's father's sister and one's father's sister's daughter, etc. Omaha kinship, like Iroquois, but further distinguishes between one's mother's side and one's father's side. Relatives on the mother's side of the family have more classificatory terms, and relatives on the father's side have more descriptive terms. Thus, Omaha kinship is like Iroquois, with the addition that a number of relatives belonging to one's mother's patrilineage are grouped together, ignoring generational differences, so that the same term is used for both one's mother's brother and one's mother's brother's son, etc. The basic principles of Crow and Omaha terminologies are symmetrical and opposite, with Crow systems having a matrilineal emphasis and Omaha systems a patrilineal emphasis. Relative age. Some languages, such as Bengali, Telugu, Tamil, Turkish, Sinhalese, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Cambodian, Vietnamese, Filipino, Hungarian, Bulgarian and Nepalese, add another dimension to some relations. Relative age. Rather than one term for brother, there exist, for example, different words for older brother and younger brother. In Tamil, an older male sibling is referred to as Annan and a younger male sibling as Thambi, whereas older and younger female siblings are called Akka and Thangai respectively. Identification of alternating generations. Other languages, such as Chiricahua, use the same terms of address for alternating generations. So a Chiricahua child calls the paternal headmother Kine, and likewise this grandmother will call her son's child Kine. Terms that recognize alternating generations and the prohibition of marriage within one's own set of alternate generation relatives are common in Australian Aboriginal kinship. The relative age and alternating generation systems are combined in some languages. For instance, Tagalog borrows the relative age system of the Chinese kinship and follows the generation system of kinship. Philippine kinship distinguishes between generation, age and, in some cases, gender. Dravidian. Floyd Lounsbury discovered a seventh Dravidian type of terminological system that had been conflated with Iroquois in Morgan's typology of kin term systems because both systems distinguish relatives by marriage from relatives by descent, although both are classificatory categories rather than based on biological descent. The basic idea is that of applying an even-odd distinction to relatives that takes into account the gender of every linking relative for ego's kin relation to any given person. AMFBD, for example, is a mother's father's brother's daughter's child. If each female link is assigned a 0 and each male a 1, the number of 1s is either even or odd, in this case, even. However, variant criteria exist. In a Dravidian system with a patrilineal modulo 2 counting system, marriage is prohibited with this relative, and a marriageable relative must be modulo 2 odd. There exists also a version of this logic with a matrilineal bias. Discoveries of systems that use modulo 2 logic, as in South Asia, Australia, and many other parts of the world, marked a major advance in the understanding of kinship terminologies that differ from kin relations and terminologies employed by Europeans. The Dravidian kinship system involves selective cousinhood. One's father's brother's children and one's mother's sister's children are not cousins but brothers and sisters one step removed. They are considered consanguineous, and marriage with them is strictly forbidden as incestuous. However, one's father's sister's children and one's mother's brother's children are considered cousins and potential mates. Marriages between such cousins are allowed and encouraged. There is a clear distinction between cross-cousins, who are one's true cousins, and parallel cousins, who are, in fact, siblings. Like Iroquois people, Dravidians refer to the father's sister as mother-in-law and the mother's brother as father-in-law. Abbreviations for genealogical relationships. The genealogical terminology used in many genealogical charts describes relatives of the subject in question. Using the abbreviations below, genealogical relationships may be distinguished by single or compound relationships, such as BC for a brother's children, MBD for a mother's brother's daughter, and so forth. B equals brother, C equals child, D equals daughter, F equals father, GC equals her child, GP equals grandparent, H equals husband, LA equals in-law, M equals mother, P equals parent, S equals son, SI equals siblings, SP equals spouse, W equals wife, Z equals sister, equals male speaking, equals female speaking.